The unbreakable promise. The start of the search. Sara remembered the day her mother had left her with her grandmother, promising that she would return soon. For years, he waited for that return, but over time he realized that it was an empty promise. That feeling of abandonment and loneliness grew in her, becoming a constant weight that she found difficult to carry. His grandmother, despite being an invaluable support, was growing older and sicker. The days seemed to get grayer and grayer, and the uncertainty about the future filled her with anxiety. One autumn afternoon, Sara was walking through the forest near her house, trying to escape the sadness she felt. Without really knowing how, he found himself standing in front of an older man who was reading with calm concentration. "Did you get lost?" the man asked, without looking up. Surprised, Sara blinked and shook her head. "I don't think so. I just came here to be alone," she replied, crossing her arms. The man nodded as if he understood. He was a calm figure, with gray hair and a weathered face, with eyes that seemed to see beyond what was visible. He presented the Bible, opening it to a page that was underlined in blue ink. "There is a verse here that has helped me a lot in my life," he said, pointing to the words. "For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life." It's John 3 verse 16. Sara looked at the book and frowned. She was skeptical about religion and had never felt that God had a place in her life. Still, something in the man's words resonated within him. "And what good does that do to me?" asked Dash. "If God loved me, I wouldn't be alone. I wouldn't be going through all this." Tomas, as he introduced himself later, nodded with a gesture of understanding. He explained that he himself had gone through dark times and that he had found refuge in those words. Sara didn't say anything else and said goodbye, but her words stayed with her. Reflections and doubts. That night, Sara couldn't sleep. Tomas' words haunted her, stirring up thoughts she preferred not to face. He wondered if a love as deep and selfless as the one described in the verse could really exist. The next morning, Sara returned to the forest. She found Tomas sitting in the same place, as if he had been waiting for her. "You're back," he commented with a smile. Sara sat next to him and, after a moment of silence, began to tell him about her life, her mother's abandonment, her grandmother's illness, and the emptiness she felt. While she spoke, Tomas listened to her attentively, without interrupting. "I've always felt like no one really loves me," he finally confessed, lowering his gaze. "That no one will stay with me." Tomas put a hand on his shoulder. "The love of God is something that transcends any other love we can know," he said calmly. "It doesn't mean you won't go through trials, but it means you'll never be alone." Sara nodded, feeling, for the first time, a little less alone. She was beginning to consider the possibility that perhaps there was something beyond the loneliness that had accompanied her all her life. The crisis. That night, while Sara and her grandmother ate dinner, the atmosphere in the house was tense. Her grandmother, who was usually an energetic and smiling woman, seemed weaker than usual, her hands trembling slightly as she held the spoon. "Are you okay, Grandma?" Sara asked, her heart pounding. "Just a little tired, dear," the old woman replied with a forced smile. "Nothing to worry about." But in the middle of dinner, her grandmother began coughing violently, putting her hand to her chest, trying to get air. Sara, terrified, called the emergency services, holding her grandmother's hand as she tried to calm her down. In the hospital, time seemed to stop. Sara clung to the hope that her grandmother would recover, but the doctors didn't give her much hope. While he waited in the living room, his thoughts were spinning uncontrollably, and Tomas' words seemed like a distant echo. "For God so loved the world," the verse came back to him again and again, like a mantra he couldn't ignore. Without really knowing why, he headed to the hospital chapel. There, in the darkness and surrounded by images of saints and religious figures, she fell to her knees and began to cry. "God, if you're there, please help me," she whispered between sobs. "I don't know what to do, I don't know if I can stand this. If you really love me, if you really love my grandmother, give me a sign, please." It was the first time in his life that he spoke to God in that way, opening up with a vulnerability he had never shown before. After a while, she felt a strange calm, as if an invisible cloak enveloped her. It was a subtle but comforting feeling, and somehow, he knew that everything would be okay, regardless of what happened. The next morning, the doctor informed him that his grandmother had shown slight improvement. They weren't out of the woods yet, but the situation was much more optimistic than they had anticipated. "It must be a miracle," the doctor said, smiling. Sara, with a beating heart, clung to that idea, convinced that her prayers had been heard. When she returned to the forest and told Tomas what had happened, the old man looked at her with a knowing expression. "God always listens, Sara, even when we don't understand how he responds," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes the answers are not what we expect, but that doesn't mean they aren't there." A new beginning. Over time, Sara recovered emotionally from the crisis she had experienced. Her grandmother was weak, but stable, and that gave Sara the opportunity to look toward the future with more optimism. Inspired by the comfort she had found, she decided to begin reading the Bible that Thomas had lent her. Although the words were confusing at first, she soon began to see a pattern of love and hope in each story. Determined to share what she had learned, she reached out to a young mother in the community, Carla, who had recently lost her husband and was struggling to cope with her 2 young children. Carla was a reserved woman and rarely talked about her feelings, but Sara did not give up. He began to visit her regularly, offering his help and, little by little, gaining her trust. One afternoon, while helping Carla clean up the mess her children had left around the house, Sara told her about the comfort she had found in faith. "At first, I didn't believe God could hear me either," Sara admitted. "But when I needed it, I felt like it was there somehow. And not only that, I felt a peace that I cannot explain. If you are ever curious, I can show you the verses that have helped me." Carla, surprised by Sara's sincerity, accepted her offer. Little by little, the visits became a ritual for both of them. Carla not only found comfort in Sara's words, but she also began reading the Bible for herself. Watching Carla begin to heal, Sara felt her own faith grow even stronger. She realized that the peace she had found was not just for her, it was something I had to share. The unbreakable promise. Sara soon became a well-known figure in her community. She began volunteering at the community center, helping the elderly and spending time with children who needed support. He didn't talk openly about his faith unless someone asked him, but his kindness and willingness to help spoke for themselves. One day, Tomas observed her while she was organizing an activity for a group of children. He looked at her with pride and admiration. "You've come a long way, Sara," he told her later, as they walked together back to the forest. Sara nodded, a calm smile on her face. "I have learned that God's love does not always show itself as we expect," he answered. "I thought I was alone, but I never was. And now, I want others to feel the same." Tomas hugged her, excited. I knew Sara was ready to carry the message of John 3 verse 16 to others, to be a beacon of hope and love in a world that often felt cold and lonely. Eventually, Sara's grandmother passed away, but instead of feeling devastated, Sara found solace in the faith she had cultivated. She had learned that life was a constant cycle of losses and gains, but that God's love was constant and eternal, an anchor in the midst of the storm. Years passed, and Sara became a leader in her community. Inspired by the love of God and the example of Thomas, she dedicated her life to helping others find the same comfort and hope that she had found. Although the difficulties never completely disappeared, Sara knew that she could always face them with the certainty that God's love was with her. And so the promise of John 3 verse 16 became the very essence of her life, an unbreakable force that guided her every day. He always remembered the words of Thomas, "The love of God is like a lamp that never goes out." And that lamp, lit in the depths of his heart, illuminated his path and that of all those who crossed his life.